A very warm welcome to you all to this evening's meeting of the White Allies Network, where we explore this question, reparations about time. Is it about time we address this issue in the 21st century? Or is it about time we thought it's a history best forgotten? We need to forgive and forget and move on. That's going to be the challenge of our panel this evening. And I'm just so delighted with the panel that we have. The giants of academia, of the media, of film and journalism, and that's just Robert Beckford, let alone everybody else. But no, I'll talk about, I'll introduce everybody in a bit more detail a bit later. But you are very welcome, whether or not you're like me, an aspiring white ally, or a person of color who is happy to journey with us as we seek to become better allies against racism. You are very, very welcome. In terms of this evening's agenda, we are going to just to remind you of our purpose as a network, of the qualities of our spaces that we try to create. Going to give you a little bit of an overview of some of the things I've spotted in the news on race and racism since we last met. There's been so much going on. And then we will be focusing on this topic for this evening, reparations about time, ? We will then have an open Q&A session after I've asked a number of questions of the panel, which will be led by one of our Council of Reference, Suzann Douglas. So do put your questions in chat, and she will be fielding those and bringing them to the panel a little bit later on in the evening. And then just to round off the evening, I will be sharing about what's next for the network and a few notices there. That we will then close the recording at 9:30 as scheduled, but you are very welcome to stay around and continue to talk about the issues on a very informal basis, an open conversation beyond that for about 15 to 20 minutes or so beyond 9:30. So that's the way things are going to pan out. Okay, so something about our aims, just to remind you, we are here to help ourselves become true allies of people of color in the fight against racial injustice. We are here to learn about ourselves as white people, our histories, our privilege, and our impact in the world. But also to learn about people of color, their histories, experiences, and perspectives too. But it's not just about talking shop. We want to develop ideas for action that we can take individually, collectively, and in partnership with others towards racial justice. And just to emphasize, everyone is welcome at our meetings. Although we call ourselves the White Allies Network, that's because we are trying to take responsibility for our own stuff. But we very much welcome co-mentors, people of color that can journey with us and help us in that quest. Just to mention some of the qualities of our spaces, some of the values that we try and uphold. We want our spaces to be respectful and non-judgmental, being slow to make negative judgments, being aware of the intersectionality of people's experiences. And we think it's really important to be humble and curious, allowed to own our own ignorance on the issues when we unintentionally offend, but also being curious about people's views that are very different to our own, pausing before responding, particularly if we feel triggered, which I know is not always easy, but that would be what we would recommend and advise. We want to be mindful and heartful, careful, thinking before we speak, considerate in our contributions and our language. We want to be both emotional and empathetic. It's okay to get emotional about this subject. We believe, in fact, it's not only okay, I think it's probably needed to engage on an emotional level too. And to not rationalize away anyone else's feelings, but able to express our own feelings and to honor other people's feelings too. And finally, we want to commit to be open and authentic, able to speak our own truths, sharing our own experiences and perspectives, but also courageous, open to challenge and to be challenged, the courage to confront ourselves and others about these issues. But we also ask you to be confidential so that what is shared is kept confidential in the context in which it is shared. Finally, we want each of us to be kind and other-centered, sensitive to each other's needs, building relationships first. Some people need more time and space than others to be able to contribute, and just allowing for that. But we also don't want to wallow in white guilt. We recognize that becoming anti-racist is not about us and our own white fragility, as it's been called, about defending our own egos, but it's about serving a greater cause for justice in this world. So those are the qualities of our spaces that we would like you to commit to as being part of this evening's session. Got any major problems with those, then you might want to spend some time elsewhere this evening. But we hope you will be able to sign up for those and uphold those values as we progress. Just to give you an indication of some of the things that we've done so far in 2023, Angela Young, one of our steering group members who's with us this evening, hi again, Angela, did an excellent session for us based on Emma Dabaru's book. We've got a recording of that on our Deeper Leaders YouTube channel, led us in a very useful conversation around that. And then Ray Smith, another one of our network members, shared his research into whiteness. Where did it come from? What is it? And why does it matter? And that recording is also available to us all. We had also booked for Lavinia Stennett, the founder and CEO of the Black Curriculum, to join us along with Elizabeth Kaur. Unfortunately, on the very evening we were due to meet in June, she was sick with COVID, and so we have had to postpone that until next year. We haven't finalized the date yet, but watch this space and we will be sharing that with the network very soon. So, bit about race and racism in the news. These are just a few headline issues. Suella Braverman has informed us that multiculturalism has failed, which you might not quite believe by looking at those pictures of recent cabinet members, but that's what that she claimed in a recent speech. Others would say perhaps it's not multiculturalism that's failed, but maybe it's the area of responsibility that she takes, the Home Office, because there have been so many different issues to do with the police, particularly in the Met Police. We were waiting a whole year for the report on Chris Carber's death when he was shot in Streatham by an armed policeman. And we heard just recently, didn't we, that that particular police officer has been charged with murder, which then sparked a strike by the armed officers of the Met Police, and some backtracking a little bit, it sounded like, from both the Met Commissioner and Suella Braverman. But we need to watch this space and see how that progresses. Going back a few decades now, it came to light in June that another suspect has been finally named, having had a number of pieces of evidence against him much earlier on. It's finally been named. So the Stephen Lawrence saga continues. But it's not just in the UK. We had the shooting of the 24-year-old Nahel in France, and the police officer has been charged there for his murder. As we're abroad at the moment, bit of good news, I would suggest. This is where Laphonza Butler has become just the third Black female senator in US history to replace the late Senator Feinstein. So that's a bit of good news. At the same time, we heard that the Supreme Court had really taken the guts out of affirmative action in the States and was rolling things back big time over there. Back in the UK, we heard this report from Cindy Butts that English cricket is deeply rooted in racism and sexism and classism. So there's still plenty to do in that area within the UK. But then I read in the Christianity magazine that a church in Bristol has decided to replace one of its stained glass windows, which had a slave trader in it, with a multi-ethnic picture of Jesus and his disciples, and come up with some stick there, but full marks to them for really making an effort to readdress some of the historical images they have. Then I recently read, I don't know whether you read anything about this, but a method of turning poor quality iron and scrap iron into good quality wrought iron was actually invented by Black metallurgists in Jamaica. It became known as the Court processes because basically Court nicked it from them. Not only did he nick it from them, but took all their equipment and destroyed their metal foundry because they were getting a little bit above themselves, inventing these important things and becoming quite influential as a result. And Court took all the credit for that. And it was actually looking back at the Industrial Revolution, this was a key process that they had invented, which helped build some of the wealth of the UK and the empire since then. But now to our subject and another member of Heirs of Slavery. We have two members here as part of our panel. Charlie Gladstone, the descendant of William Gladstone, apologized for links to slavery, and we'll hear more perhaps about that a bit later. But also another member of heirs of slavery, David Lascelles, the current Earl of Harewood. I don't know whether you picked this up from the news, but commissioned this portrait of David Harewood, whose ancestors were enslaved by the Earl of Harewood's ancestors as well. And so really take my hat off to David Lascelles, who's really trying to turn around the history of that's represented within Harewood House. And I think was John, were you there for this unveiling? I think you may have been, or one or two members of Heirs of Slavery were. So that was good to see that happening. At the same time, of course, we had an ex-Tory MP who tried to hide her family slavery links when a researcher at Cambridge, I think it was, researched into his own history. And talked about that. She complained she didn't want to be connected with her family's history there. So a very different approach to the heirs of slavery that are represented here today. Finally, quite a challenging report here about the C of E charity, the USPG, who gave some money as what they felt was part of reparations, but were criticized and saying this is actually not reparations as far as we're concerned from the Barbadian authorities. So we'll come back to that a little bit later. When are reparations not reparations in terms of those that receive them perspective? So that's a quick run through of the news. From my perspective, you'll have other things. In fact, things just coming out the last couple of days, which I could have added to that, but it just didn't have time. But let's introduce our panel now. Professor Robert Beckford, one of our leading UK Black academics. In fact, isn't it easier just to say he is the leading UK Black academic? Probably, it's probably accurate to say that. But really, he's now at Winchester University, the director of the Institute for Climate and Social Justice, having previously been at the Queen's Foundation, and is an activist scholar working interdisciplinarily to address, confront, and overturn injustice in African mainland and diaspora communities. But he's also a BAFTA award-winning documentary maker, whose credits include the hard-hitting 2005 Channel 4 documentary, The Empire Pays Back, which was one of the first, I think, attempts to really quantify compensation and what was owed, in a sense, to those that were enslaved and suffered at the hands of the transatlantic slave trade. So over the years, I mean, I love, if you go back and search online, you'll find a number of his documentaries still available. In fact, a few of them we have put links to in our resource network, and you can access them via that means. And just more recently, this was very brave, I must confess, Robert, hats off to you, but you managed to share, it was a long-running family argument in a BBC Radio 4 series dealing with the experiences of the Caribbean immigrants who came to the UK as part of the Windrush generation, and whether or not even their own children should return to the Caribbean. So hats off to you for that very brave Radio 4 series. And secondly, we have Alex Renton, who is an award-winning investigative journalist, has written articles for all the big dailies, I would suggest. But 2021, wasn't it? He wrote Blood Legacy, which was reckoning on his own family's story of slavery, which was longlisted for the Baillie Gifford Prize. I've just finished reading that myself, and I really do recommend it to you as a real insight from a variety of perspectives into what it was like to both run a plantation in the Caribbean, but also what kind of suffering was produced as a result of that. So I do recommend Alex's book to you. And then we also have John Dower, an award-winning filmmaker, and so many of the household names he has been involved in directing at some stage, of EastEnders, Casualty, Silent Witness, just being some examples of those. But also some of our most popular computer games, he's been involved in directing some of the cinematic sequences for those. He also took a lead when he discovered his own family's history from the slave trade of leading the Trevelyan family's apology to Grenada. Just earlier this year, he led his family's apology there. Both of them, Alex and John, are founder members of the Heirs of Slavery. And we are very pleased that you could join us this evening. Finally, although Suzann is not on the panel, I just wanted to show her face because she will be taking those questions from you as we go through. So do put those questions in the chat as soon as anything appears to you. All right, I'm going to stop rambling now on that. And James, if we could just highlight our panel, that would be fantastic. And start to work through the questions. So my first question to you, gentlemen, is this. First of all, what do we mean by reparations? I don't know whether one of you could just give us a definition in a couple of sentences on what we mean by reparations. Anyone want to offer?
I think it should be Robert. You've billed us thank you, Adrian, as an expert panel, but I'm no expert on net reparations. I hope I'm good at listening to what people descended from the enslaved, would like to happen by way of repair.
Sure.
Sure.
Thank you for that wonderful introduction. Let me first correct by saying I'm not the leading Black British academic. If I was, we'd be in serious trouble. There are people who are working at more prestigious institutions than mine and who have done more scholarly work than me. My genius, if at all, has just been getting to some of these issues first, then bringing them to public attention. So I shouldn't take credit for the work of other people who are doing more dynamic things than me. But to get to the point, reparations, look, it is a complex and diverse and contradictory concept. But there are three things that help us think through it. The first is the notion of repair. It has its roots, its etymology in the notion of repair. So reparations is about repairing damage that has been done. Now, there's a legal definition. The legal definition emerges after World War II, and that deals with transitional justice. The idea that when great wrongs have been done, Holocaust, mass murder, a genocide, then normal legal practices are insufficient. So you need legal practices that deal with these large-scale atrocities and offer some kind of recompense. And that's the legal way of seeing this. And the recompense can be symbolic, it can be material, it can be financial, but it has to deal with the psychological, physical, emotional, political, cultural harm that has been done. And that's the definition that most people work with, and that has certain levers that you pull in order for reparations to take place. And we'll probably get into this later on, but if you watch the 2005 film, which you mentioned, Empire Pays Back, or more recently, the Brattle Report, we work through 5 levers that you have to use as measures for the kind of reparation that needs to take place, financial reparations specifically. But there's another definition that I work into reparations because of the African Caribbean background, and that's a spiritual definition. And why a spiritual definition? Well, for 2 reasons. First of all, because the idea of restitution, doing repair when damage has been done, is a very biblical idea. It has its roots in the Hebrew Bible. We see numerous stories and accounts of people doing wrong and then being asked to engage in recompense, acts of recompense. You've done wrong to somebody, you have to give them 2 chickens if you stole 1 chicken. The idea is that you give back more than what you have taken away. There's even reparation in the Hebrew Bible for historical structural injustice. There's a fantastic story in the book of Ezra. Sorry, I'm getting a little Bible study here. A fantastic story in the book of Ezra where King Darius recognizes that even that's 90 years since the Hebrews were taken into captivity, into bondage in Babylon. He decides to have a tax to pay back what they have lost and to help them rebuild Jerusalem. So notion that even if you haven't necessarily been involved yourself, because you may have benefited from that wrong, you should do something about it. That's the first reason it's in the Bible. The second reason is because it is the Rastafarian movement who for the last 80 years, so 1920s, have carried the reparations movement, and they viewed it as spiritual practice, as a return to Africa initially as part of their religious understanding of the centrality of Africa, and then also, or more recently, in 2020, understanding that there needed to be some kind of financial recompense as a consequence of that. So that's a useful way of seeing it in terms of its etymology. At its roots is this notion of repair, the legal category, that it requires some kind of restitution for large-scale damage, and that there are legal levers and measures that you use to measure the amount of compensation or reparation. And then thirdly, this is about reconciliation, about bringing people back together, uniting people and bringing about a sense of peace. And that peace isn't just the absence of war, but it's also the absence of any kind of oppressive system or process. And that's the spiritual dimension. So I tend to conflate those three definitions to broaden out what is understood by reparations.
Fantastic. Thanks, Robert. And I'll come back to you in just a moment, because I'd like to hear from each of you, all three of you, how you started to actually become aware of this issue and this potential need for reparations. Maybe because Robert's been speaking, I'll go to the other two first. So, Alex, can I come to you? When did it start to become an issue that you started to feel passionate about? What were some of the triggers for you that you needed to address something here?
I mean, to my shame, I really very recently. And literally when I was digging around in, as I tell in my book, in the boxes of old family papers that my grandfather catalogued in a house in Scotland, and kept seeing the words Jamaica and Tobago coming up, and which as complete novelty to, a surprise to me. I mean, none of my generation had any notion that our family, who we'd been brought up to respect and kind of worship, really, as sort of great soldiers of empire and judges and politicians and so on, had been involved in the enslavement business. And of course, being a 62-year-old Briton, I was taught very little about the enslavement industry and Britain's involvement. Everyone here knows about that problem. But I think the key moment was, about 2 years after I've started first reading those papers and transcribing them, it was finding myself in Tobago on the site of a plantation that one of my great grandfathers had owned, and asking people there what they thought I should do with this knowledge, and what the enslavement period, how it affected their lives today. And I think, in those fascinating conversations, I had the same in Jamaica a bit later as well. I was very lucky and privileged to, and people were very welcoming and really pleased to have the chance to talk about these things. Though there was a lot of anger and pain that needed expressing too. But what I was hearing was a desire for healing, for an ongoing trauma that was by no means over, and specifics were mentioned. I won't go into them there, but things that really made sense in terms of what the racist way in which my ancestors, who were Christians, had, or they called themselves such, had been able to enslave African people, Black people, and how that repeats today. And I think, I think that was the point when hearing from people, and almost everyone I spoke to in both countries said, acknowledgement, apology. That's your first job, and that's the beginning of curing, of addressing the history, stopping the pain which you white people's denial of it brings about, and the social consequences of that same denialism. And all those conversations started with talk about, as Robert says, about a healing process that started with acknowledgement and apology, and that was a absolutely blinding moment of revelation to me, but also a deeply shameful moment to think I'd got to 56 years old or whatever without realizing, despite living as a liberal journalist in modern Britain with a really wide friendship group, realizing what my brothers of color and sisters of color were going through.
Yeah. Thank you, Alex. John, how about yourself? What kind of sparked your own awareness of the issues and passion for doing something about it?
I've got quite a similar story to Alex in a way. So what I'll do is I'll tell a story slightly differently from my perspective, and I'll give you 5 bullet points. First was 2016. I read an article by David Olusoga in The Guardian, which said any middle class or landed gentry or upper class person white person should go to the UCL Legacies of Database now and find out whether their family were involved, and I thought, oh, right, okay, I'll do that. And I went and I discovered when I entered the word Trevelyan, which is my father's family, that we had owned, our ancestors had owned or plantations on Grenada and been involved in enslaving people there. And I was completely dumbfounded, and my life changed at that moment, literally at that moment. And I rang my dad and said, we have to apologize for this. So he didn't know anything about it either. And I was very upset and angry and felt very let down and very shamed and felt very ashamed of my ancestors not being, having swept all of this under the carpet. That's the first moment. The second moment, I think, because it took 7 years, this process, I do think that George Floyd's death has to be mentioned, because I think that was a seismic moment. Because I think what that did is it made a lot of people sit up and go, oh my God, this is a real, I mean, I'm talking about people, white people, particularly people in my family. We were all sitting around in pandemic, I think, probably doing a bit of navel gazing and having a bit of time to think. And I think at that moment, I think people were very, very thought provoked. So I think that was an incredibly important moment in the galvanization of our family's apology. The third moment was the Colston statue going down, because as soon as that went down, I think people went, oh my God, this is happening here, and it's big, and it's, oh my God, what do we think about this? Because all the people in my family who'd kind of gone, yeah, but is this really an important, is this something we can do something about now? I think they really began to see the bells ringing in the present day that had kind of ceased tolling for so many centuries. The fourth moment was when our family was addressed to Hilary Beckles, who was the head of Reparations Commission for CARICOM and also vice chancellor of the University of West Indies. And he just said something really, really, really powerful to us, because at that moment we were really doubting whether apology was something we could do, because there was a lot of people in the family quite rightly saying, you can't actually technically apologize for something you didn't do, which is actually, you know, philosophically, I think, correct. But he said very simply, look, no one has come to the people of Grenada and apologized for what your ancestors did. No one has done that. And so if you do that, it will be a massive thing to do. And it's not that massive a thing for you to do. And it will be such a powerful message to be giving. So that speech that Sir Hilary gave to us as a family, I think, was the key turning point in our family's kind of, many people were persuaded that this was something we should do. And then my last point was just the moment we stood in the hall in St. George's in Grenada, me and Laura Trevelyan, my cousin, and we read out our family apology. And suddenly at that moment, I realized I
think might need to come back to John to hear his last point there. But can I turn to you, Rob? You've been writing and broadcasting about this issue for longer than most of us have been even aware of it. But when was the first point that you kind of started to think about reparations, the potential need for it? Can you just give us an indication of what sparked that for you and when?
Well, people of my vintage who are in their late 50s can go back to the 1970s, when the notion of the notion of reparations was integral to Rastafari discourse in reggae music. So if you listen to reggae music from 1970 to 1980s, Burning Spear, Steel Pulse in Britain, even Bob Marley, Black Uhuru, all of these bands talked about reparations in terms of return to Africa, even a little bit earlier in the late 1960s with the Abyssinians. So it was part of my consciousness growing up, hearing this discourse in reggae music. So that was the beginning of thinking about it. But a real turning point came for me going to Jamaica and talking to my relatives and recognizing that they were not interested. Now, reparations was not really a popular theme across the Caribbean in the 1990s, even in the noughties, because Caribbean people thought that you could never repay for the damage that was done. So they just completely dismissed it. So my second awakening was being given the opportunity when I was working more consistently with Channel 4 to make Empire Pays Back. And the plan there was primarily not only to calculate reparations using financial measures and legal measures, but more so challenge Caribbean people to think more critically about the stance that they'd taken. And that battle was won. We featured both Hilary Beckles in the film. We didn't manage to get out to Jamaica. The Channel 4 budget wasn't big enough to give us that kind of trip. But we managed to engage Caribbean people with the film afterwards. And Vereen Shepherd, who went on to become the head of the reparations research unit at the University of the West Indies, Mona in Jamaica. She tells the story that when the film traveled across Jamaica, we never got the royalties for it though, but that's a whole nother story. When it traveled across Jamaica, being screened in various institutions, that was a catalyst for what then became CARICOM reparations. So for me, I feel really, really chuffed about the fact that the film played that role in sparking that movement and conscientizing people like Marine, Tulu Beckles and others, and getting them moving on this project. So that was the second awakening to a degree. There's a third point, and this is another a project which is more recent. Post George Floyd, I raised the issue again, but looking at the church's entanglement with transatlantic chattel slavery, and two media projects. One that was a critique of the USPG, called The Church's Slave Plantation, which went on BBC World Service, a two-part documentary series, and then the independent film After the Flood, Slavery, the Church and Reconciliation. That was a 2022 independent film made for the Move for Justice and Reconciliation. That was to really engage with what was happening with the Church of England and within religious groups who had reached a tipping point regarding reparations. So those three areas really, being brought up with it, Empire Pays Back, pushing the Caribbean folk to do more, and more recently trying to conscientize Christian communities.
Right, brilliant. Thank you, Robert.
Adrian, can you still hear me?
Yes, John, you're back with us.
Okay, look, I realised that it sounded as though my Wi-Fi cut out at my climax, which is very frustrating.
No, we were dying to hear your last point. So
so the last point was this. I stood in front of this audience in Grenada making this apology, and I suddenly realised very clearly, with clarity, that I was being looked at as literally as a personification or as a representative of what my ancestors did, and it was an incredibly powerful, uncomfortable, enlightening moment in which I think the pennies dropped from my eyes, and I suddenly realized this is actually the relationship that I need to work on. I need to atone for this. I mean, meeting people in the hotel who were serving us, who could well have been the descendants of the enslaved that my ancestors were involved with, is incredibly humbling. And you go. I mean, I left Grenada a different person, I think, than I went, and I think that was a really, for me, a massively important moment to have experienced.
Brilliant. Thanks, John, for we were waiting with bated breath that last.
Yes, I apologise for my Wi-Fi.
Actually, while you have the floor, while your Wi-Fi is working well, a question for you and for Alex. I would imagine that there'd probably be members of your families that would say, for goodness sake, this is so long ago, why can't we just forget it? Why bring it all up again? Why bring up all this pain from the past? Why don't everyone just forgive and forget and move on from this, rather than bringing up in this day and age? What would your response to that, John, be first of all, and Robert? Yes,
we had a few people who had that attitude in the family, and I think over time that has really shifted. And I'll give you an example. Laura's uncle, Tom, who is in his 80s and is a retired doctor and is a very sensible person, very sort of, I'd call him quite middle of the road, quite straightforward. He very much felt like, why is this something that we can do anything about? It really, it's something we need to just move on from. Let's let bygones be bygones. And I think it was all of those things I was describing, all of those moments during, the death of George Floyd, Colston statue, the Black Lives Matter marches. And then Laura created a fantastic documentary called Grenada, Confronting the Past, which was commissioned by the BBC, where she went to Grenada and filmed on some of the plantations that the family had been involved with. And I think at that moment, he's a good representative of what I would call a kind of Middle England kind of attitude. I think he has completely changed. He came with us to Grenada. He says to me, John, I was wrong. I now understand that what you were talking about was something really significant. So I think that's a really, for me, he's a really good barometer and a good, for me, a success story of where we might go with this. I mean, I hope that represents other people in Britain and that we can start to persuade them. But certainly it is a journey that we've got to go on with people.
Sure. Thanks, John. Alex, what about yourself? What would your counter argument be?
Yeah, there's a rift in our family, certainly. I mean it's only a small it's only, I think, probably 40 of the extended family are completely on side. They're not happy. But they can see why this is the right thing to do, and why we should feel shame at not having done it earlier. And 2 or 3 are very, very angry, and really for not good reasons at all. But they're interesting and useful because they kind of reflect something that's going on in British culture generally. Because we all know that there is, the old white right, as I like to call them simply, are in denial about this history, as they are any criticism of Britain's colonial history and history as an empire. And what I've come to realize, because people I love now have turned out to be on that side, is that it's an existential challenge to their self-belief, their understanding of themselves as white Britons, and that and the best people from the best empire there ever was, I say with a very wry smile, because that is what we were taught, and this is and it's behind an awful lot. That British exceptionalism is behind an awful lot of things that now go wrong. Are wrong in this country. What's been really exciting, I think, for John and me and others, and is this experience of doing our own apologies and saying we're listening, we hear, we'd like to ally and support with black activist movements for equality and for reparations. Is everyone who's done it so far, and we have a lot of conversations with people saying, I'm thinking of doing this, what are the risks, will I get my windows smashed? I've literally had that question asked, is being able to tell what a positive thing it's been, how everybody from David Lascelles, who first did this back in 2007, has said it's expanded their world, it's made them feel more at peace with the family history that is not, they can't avoid having, and has brought friendship and kindness and different perspectives into their lives, and it's been entirely an enriching experience. We're very privileged, people like John and me, to be able to do this at all. Right. And to have the chance to go out and say, right, and talk to our neighbours of colour and start those conversations.
Thank you, Alex. I want to turn to Robert, but with a very specific question around this, because Robert, you talked about the kind of spiritual aspect of it. You're a Christian theologian. What about the doctrine of forgiveness? What about those that would say, hang on a minute, isn't it time to forgive and forget? If you're coming from a Christian perspective, forgive, forget, and move on, rather than dig up the pain and the stuff from the past. What would your response to that be, Robert?
Sure. Firstly, I'd correct the theology, because forgive and forget isn't necessarily part of the Judeo-Christian tradition. It's a little bit more sophisticated and demands a bit more. A good story to work with, the story of Zacchaeus in the New Testament, where Jesus encounters a tax collector, a bad person who's done bad things to people financially. Jesus encounters him, and he gets converted on the spot, and decides that he's going to repay 4 times as much as what he's taken away from people. And that's a better example of how encountering injustice and transformation works. It isn't necessarily just about forgiving and forgetting, it's about making amends for the injustice. There's also an argument that you don't forget until if the injustice is continuing. There's a theological tradition that works that way. But in terms of forgiveness, we have to see it as 2 parties coming together as a consequence of a process. And I think there's a very specific process at work here. I think that reparations begins with dealing with what Alex has spoken about, what the great dean of British sociology, Stuart Hall, used to describe as selective historical amnesia. We have a lacuna in our history when it comes to the slave and colonial world. So we have to begin with truth seeking. We have to really mine the historical archives and work out what actually took place. And there's been some great work on this. UCL database, the work they're doing out at Mona, other places now opening up their archives. Lloyd's, who back in 2005 shut their doors to us, is now opening up their doors. After that, there has to be truth telling, and that's where the heirs have to tell the truth, and that's what they've been doing. With Trevelyan family, with Alex, with the other families. That's an important part of this is truth telling, saying this is what happened, And then I think there's another stage, which is then where you get to negotiating and thinking about the kind of repair and the multifaceted nature of repair that there is. And that process then takes you into reconciliation. And reconciliation does involve the gift of forgiveness, because it's a gift, in the Christian tradition, in the same way that being able to say that you're sorry is a gift, in the Christian tradition as well. And then you kind of journey together. So it's much more than a one-off instant thing. It's a journey that people are on and that they have to work at for some time.
Could I say one other thing, which is a point I missed? I mean, the key argument I use, and it happens a lot talking to the media, talking to the right-wing press, and with my own family, is it is not ancient history. A history isn't over while its after effects are still active. And I say to people, you have Black friends, go out and ask them in what way the story of enslavement, the enslavement period, affects Black lives in Britain today. And by the time you ask that, because you will be told very frankly and very simply and statistically exactly how that happens, both in racism and health outcomes and judicial outcomes and educational outcomes and so on. It is a live history. We'd have no right to say it's over and ancient. And I think actually we as white allies can put that argument quite well.
Right. And you make some really good points around that in your book, Alex, don't you, in terms of the long-term impact in Jamaica, specifically. And that's something that we've been learning a lot about in the White Allies Network, about the long-term impact, the legacy of empire and colonialism, and the fact there's more money coming out of Africa in interest payments than there is going in as aid or any development help at all. That was quite a revelation to us as a network. And the legacy in health and economics and education, just mental health, particularly in self-esteem, has just had such an enormous impact for generations, hasn't it? We're certainly learning that afresh as a network here. I wonder whether we can turn to then, well, what still needs to be done? As a slavery, you've explained some of the things that you've been doing, but what needs to be done on I guess on three levels? For the heirs of slavery, you've been tackling at the family level, haven't you? You've been looking at what the responsibility of your ancestors there. But open to whoever wants to answer this to start with. I'd like it to kind of someone to say, well, what should be happening at individual level, maybe family level, and at governmental level? I don't know whether one of you wants to tackle each one of those, but and you might share something of what you know is already going on, but what still needs to happen? What are the key things, would you say? Open to all three of you. Would like to say that. Who'd like to tackle that first?
I might quickly say that, if anyone goes to the Heirs of Slavery website, I'll post it into the chat. We formed this group, which is a sort of loose advocacy group, really to support and ally ourselves with activist movements seeking reparative justice. And I think because while there are wealthy heirs of slavery and not so wealthy heirs of slavery, anything we do in terms of the lives our ancestors destroyed and the subsequent legacy crimes is token. What we need is governmental action at governmental level through CARICOM, separately perhaps for the diaspora, and heirs of slavery is there to bring what influence we have as privileged white people to support the activist movement seeking that stuff, because that's how real change comes about, along with what we said about acknowledgement and apology.
Sure. Great. Thanks, Alex. John, anything you'd like to add to that?
Yes, I'm sorry, my Wi-Fi is again troubling me. I don't know whether Alex mentioned the really important thing that Heirs of Slavery are doing is to try and make other descendants of enslavers less intimidated and feel as though it's a safe space for them to come on board and to engage. We're setting up meetings. We've certainly had lots and lots and lots of people approaching us via our website who want to get more information. And I think it's that thing that Alex said before about people being scared of their windows being broken. I think that's what we're trying to do, is we're trying to create a sense that this is actually a growing set of people. It's a growing coalition, and we're certainly getting lots and lots of interest. And I think that's a really important part of our work, is to create a safe space for people to come on board and engage in the conversation and try and grow with us.
Brilliant. Thank you, John. Robert, I remember in The Empire Pays Back, what you calculated to need to be paid back actually would bankrupt the country. And you said, you know, that's not feasible in those terms. And I haven't read the Brattle report yet, although that is on our website, so you can access that the full report on our resource page. What needs to happen at a governmental level, would you say?
Yeah, I think it's a good question. Look, I think on a personal level, it requires moral courage. And I think that's what both the heirs of slavery have been doing and what you've been doing in terms of white allies. It requires, you know, that desire to do the right thing and take the risks that come with moral courage. I think that's what we all have to do on a personal level. I think on a social level, it's about educating people. There still is a battle in terms of making people aware of the slave and colonial history, how it continues to impact life in the present. I remember going on Radio 5 Live 10 years ago, and Simon Mayo saying, you know, slavery bad, racism bad, but I can't see the connection between the two. You know, Simon Mayo. So we still have to do that work. And that education coupled with moral courage, I believe, leads to conscientizing people, changing people. And a good example of that is if you see my piece in The Guardian from last week on the Beckford statue in the Guildhall. After that, I got a call from the Beckford Hospitality Company. I didn't know there was one in the West Country with you know, has about 200 people working for it, and they simply appropriated the name from a local hero, William Beckford, the Gothic novel, the originator of the Gothic novel, you know, and further conspiracies, not conspiracies, controversies are related to his background, and therefore they're not necessarily an inheritor of wealth or power from the slave and colonial world directly. But they felt that they'd made a mistake, and they wanted to know, how do we address this? So we're involved in a really creative dialogue at the moment to look at how we can work through this issue. It isn't necessarily about changing the name. It's really about opening up opportunity to do some really progressive anti-racism work in the hospitality industry and in other sectors that they're involved in as well. So the education, I think, is still really, really important. And look, you know, if the polls are anything to go by, there will be a change in government in the next a year or so. And if there is, then there are real opportunities for getting state-based support and renewed interest. We do have the cross-parliamentary group at work at the moment. We do have key people in the Labour Party who are really committed to some kind of exploration at least, and I think that's where the big change will take place, because with government policy you can then change what happens in education. You can start investing in having some of the major reports and research that needs to take place in order for large-scale change to take place. Now, just one more thing about the figures. My approach to it is very different from the lawyers. You know, when you work with the lawyers, and the American lawyers in particular, they think any amount of money is repayable. It isn't part of their consciousness at all, you know. But my approach to this is just twofold. I think we have to do the calculations in order to honor the memory of the enslaved. We have to say this is what they actually contributed, and this is how much, you know, wealth was gained. But remembering that's not just one part of the repair, and then placing that in dialogue with what is feasible today. How does repair look like today? Because often the two do not necessarily equate. The problem has been that that hasn't often taken place. So if you look at the USPG case, where you have an Anglican missionary organization from 1710 to 1838/1834 running a slave plantation in the Barbados, and tried to keep the stock up to 300 enslaved Africans a year. So we're talking at least 1,000 plus people. Now, nobody has done the calculating, the math in terms of how many enslaved Africans do you have to compensate, and what levers do you have to use in order to come to a reasonable sum. Instead, what's happened there is the USPG has negotiated what they feel would be a reasonable settlement with the Codrington estate, not using any facts and figures, not being very transparent about it, not using any legal measures. And as a consequence, it's been rejected by commentators in Barbados. It may still be accepted by the college, because the college is in dire straits, you see. And that raises the question about the power relations in some of these negotiations, and people being able to pick and choose what they feel is restorative. So that's why I asked for the calculation, so we can get a clear idea of the debt. But obviously, I don't think, USPG has, over £1 billion in their coffers. But if that is the amount that is due, we need to at least acknowledge that, and then move into a phase of saying, well, what does repair look like for Barbados, for the USPG, and how do we go on this journey together?
Right. Brilliant. And is there an end? Could there ever be an end to reparations, Robert? Bearing in mind just the kind of the massive debt that is owed, and as you say, we can't repay it all. But is there an end point at all? Can you ever see that?
Well, I think it's a journey to rebuild the world in the way that people thought they could do after empire. Now, after empire, these great anti-colonial leaders across Africa, across Latin America, had these great meetings, Bandung and others, where they attempted to think about what kind of institutions, global institutions, were necessary to restore their countries, give them self-determination, give them access to finance and global financial markets, restore their cultural traditions in the post-colonial world. And that's what they wanted. They wanted to, and there's actually a version of reparations which is constructivist. It's about investing in the civic institutions and organizations to build a better anti-racist future. So in many respects, it's not so much about will it end, it's about we need to start doing the work that many of the post-colonial activists and nations wanted to do at that point, including, addressing the legacy of racism, legacy of colonialism as well. So for me, it's more about looking back than necessarily looking forward. We're starting a process that has its origins not only in the colonial world, but in terms of the repair in the post-colonial world.
Thank you, Robert. Anything else, any other panel members want to add in terms of how do we as a network, we want to be able to be activists in this area and not just talking about it? I think you've already mentioned issues of educating ourselves and of aligning ourselves with activists, Black activists in this area, so that we hopefully will earn the right to be called true allies against racism. But is there anything else you'd like to add in terms of practically what members of this network can do? From anyone? Yeah, Alex.
I think, I mean, Robert mentioned it. I mean, remember that discussing or answering at least the CARICOM call for discussions with European nations on a reparative justice plan in 2014, that was acknowledged in the 2019 Labour manifesto. I mean, there is one line there. I mean, anyone here with with a Labour Party candidate and a line into them, we're all voters, should be saying we want to see that in Keir Starmer's manifesto for next year, or better. I mean, the Dutch government, the Danish government have already gone further in answering the to an extent in answering the CARICOM call, at least in acknowledgement and apology. There are political openings, and I think good activism, good allyship and campaigning is seeing winnable results and pushing forward. And the next government could take this on, and I think also to add to Robert, I think I'm really sort of shocked by how many people like me who are kind of on side on the reparations. You can see the validity of the claim, don't really understand what's been asked for at all, and think it is just trillions because that's what the Daily Mail has told them. Now, Robert's absolutely right. You need to quantify what the money lost by the Africans and all their descendants who were kidnapped and murdered by us. What that comes to, but the CARICOM plan, and everyone should read it, includes lots of reconciliatory, useful ideas, ranging from technology transfer to better educational opportunities, and a great idea which worked for Gordon Brown and the G8, which is cancellation of debt. That it's not just about writing a big fat check.
Adrian, just to add to that, I think the reason why people think, and this is particularly coming from the right-wing press, that it's all about money, is because a huge vacuum has been formed by the fact that the government and the institutions and the king are all silent. So we have no leadership on this. We have no responsible power answering what CARICOM, for example, has been asking for. And into that void, all sorts of rumors, ideas, whatever, the Twitterati, all of that just goes crazy. And so the reason why it's become so kind of slanderous and so horrific in terms of the kind of rumors and the nonsense that's been spoken in many places is because of that void. And that void, we need to fill it. The government need to stand up. And one thing I would say is that Rishi Sunak, this is something that Charlie Gladstone said, and I think he encapsulates it really well. Rishi Sunak, in answer to Bell Riviera's question about whether the government was going to think about reparations, he said, "We don't want to unpick the past." And what about the present? The present is a place where we can see the terrible divisions. We can see the repercussions of the great wound that was created through transatlantic chattel slavery. And so that I think is a really important question.
Brilliant. Thank you, John. I want to hand over to Suzann to kind of take some questions from the floor. Sean, I can see you've got your hand up. Do you want to make a very quick point before Suzann brings in the questions?
Yes.
Connected with something.
So my name's Sean. I work in venture capital. I'm not an activist, okay? I work in venture capital, and the thing about this idea of reparations, should we pay it or not? There's already a precedent, okay? There are other African groups have been apologized in Kenya. The Aborigines have been apologized. The Irish have been apologized in the Caribbean for some strange reason. We haven't been apologized. So in our eyes, the reason why reparations is important, because what we realized when David Cameron went down to the Caribbean, went to Jamaica to build a prison, right? What the governments realized, we need to control the narrative, because if we don't control the narrative, then others will make the stories for us.
Thanks, Sean, and you've made some good comments in the chat as well. Brilliant. Suzann, can I hand over to you now? There's been lots of activity in the chat, I can see. Can I hand over to you to kind of field some questions for the panel for us?
Yeah, definitely. I'll pick up questions. If I miss any, then please, just raise your hand or send them again and I'll try and pick them up. But just when you were talking about what can be done, so Alex, you talked about government action. There needs to be government action. And I can see a couple of questions on the chat about the tension between government action and the implications. So Peter Grant, he asks, what are the tensions between the roles of governments and individuals as both donors and recipients of reparations? How do we avoid reparations being at the expense of government development assistance for poorer countries?
Right, I think that's a really good point, and and we all know that if government gives with one hand, it tends to take with the other, and even as this debate has been going on in a more energetic way since 2014, British overseas aid to Caribbean nations has gone down by about 80%. So I think there's a very strong argument. I think I listen to reparations activists and I try. I'm learning that whatever settlements eventually come out, and I think this will be very gradual, are not directed through government spending. I think government has a role in negotiating and obviously in the apology and acknowledgement side, but ultimately I don't think the governments as we have them at the moment all over the world are reliable enough to channel whatever flow of money comes through. But in terms of, I know a bit about the Church of England's £100 million reparations fund, which is just being designed at the moment. There's no intention of that being payments to governments. It would be payments to enterprises, to educational charities and so on. I think, having worked for Oxfam, another white saviour organisation, you might say, for a while, and seen how aid at that level can go so badly wrong, I think a new model for deliverance, designed by the beneficiaries, designed by the people in need, is what we need.
That makes a lot of sense. So repaying, so the beneficiaries getting together and devising a model, so just do this away from government, really.
Yes.
Yeah.
Everything around this has to be designed by the descendants of those who were enslaved, and West Africa as well, from which people were kidnapped and taken in their millions.
Yeah. There's also an additional question about government. So this is from Jarette. So she says, coming from the US, so sorry if some of the issues do not perfectly translate one-to-one, But she says, do you believe governing bodies keep refusing the recognition or acknowledgement of slavery because of political implication? And will it fast forward the process of return and redistribution? So I'm not sure who wants to answer that, whether it's you, Alex, or John. Robert?
Sure. Yeah, of course. There's political pressure all the time. And I can't talk about it because I had to sign NDAs with the organizations that I've worked with. So I can tell you that there are major high street banks, there are major institutions who have looked into their past, done the truth seeking, but realized for a variety of political reasons they can't come out, so to speak, because they worry about the political fallout. So that's real. But I think the good news is that if we had said this, 20 years ago, we'd put Lloyd's Shipping in that category, Lloyd's Insurers in that category. And they next month have their first national meeting where they are going to talk about research they've conducted with Johns Hopkins University on their involvement in the transatlantic chattel slave trade. So, while there are organizations that feel they can't do it politically today, Lloyd's were like that 20 years ago, but now have moved on. So the hope is that the political climate will change and that organizations will feel more comfortable with acknowledging this past, opening up their archives and doing the restorative work.
Yeah. Thank you, Robert. There was also a question on what can be done. And John, you talked about making other descendants feel safe. So, in a way, psychological safety. And I was quite struck when you were both talking, you were talking about, the process that happens. So the fear, the risks, the shame that comes up. John, you talked about Uncle Tom and his, not wanting to get into the process, but then the documentary that I guess helped him to come to terms with the history. And also you talked about the reward that comes from doing this work, just reconciling the family history and feeling safer. So there's a question here about psychological safety, and it's from Neil. So he says, I'm interested in the psychological effects of 400 years of British Empire slavery and beyond on white British people. Is there scope for including this aspect in reparations? Helen Morgan at Tavistock Clinic has written a book about the work of whiteness, covering these psychological aspects.
I think that's a brilliant question, and it's been something that's come up quite a few times from Black groups that I've talked to. Have said, don't forget there is trauma on your side too. And when they first said that, I remember this being said to me and me thinking, what trauma? And then, of course, if you look into sort of any kind of psychology, you understand that the bully, the oppressor, the person who's behaved in a kind of in an inappropriate way, they also go through some kind of psychological damage by doing that. And I think we don't acknowledge as white people, I'm speaking now on behalf of, I guess, white people, that we don't acknowledge the damage that has been created over many centuries by this. And I do think that takes its toll. And I think it's something that's, and I'm by the way, at no point am I saying feel sorry for me, because that's not why I'm saying it. But I do think that we need to start acknowledging that this has been a traumatic centuries that has taken its toll on everybody. And the more that we can understand that. And I also wanted to say something about apology, because for me, it's really interesting, this conversation about reparations. But I think we have to begin with apology, because at the end of the day, I don't think anyone is rightfully going to accept the notion of reparation if they don't feel it comes from the heart. If they don't feel it comes genuinely from a place of humbleness and willingness to say bad things happened, crimes of humanity were committed by our ancestors. If we're not able to say that, I don't think we can really move on in a meaningfully makes things better. And I think their education is really on at schools. These about the colonialism. They don't look about the terrible things people in this country.
John, your bandwidth is low again. I don't know whether if you just turn your camera off and continue to speak, whether that might help.
Can I take the space very quickly?
Okay.
As a colleague, I think, I mean, I completely agree with John, but also, there's an interesting term around it, and Kendi Andrews has written a new book about it, white psychosis. And I think, one of the first things that happened to me when I asked a black friend, when I started studying out of my project, this 4 years ago, what she thought I should do with the history I was uncovering, and she said, I really don't want to hear any more about the horrors of slavery. I've had that all my life. What I want to do is know how you white people are going to heal yourselves, because you're still the problem. We're not. You're still making people suffer on grounds of skin color, and part of your illness is that you're in denial about what happened in the past, and you're in denial about what happens now. And that was a really important thing to hear, and it's something I repeat to people like me, and I hope that that finishes John's answer.
Brilliant. Thanks, Alex. Yeah, before I come to Robert, John, do you want to just finish what you were saying?
Sure, yes. I mean, I think I was just really making that's very, very important point, but also I was just pointing out about education. I do think education is a great problem, that we do not teach enough about this. People don't know about this history. The reason why we're constantly asked, how come you're so late to this conversation? And I go, because I didn't know about it. And even my family, my family trumpeted its liberal values. My great grandfather was a Labour MP. He was in the first Labour cabinet as an education minister. He took, if anyone talked about slavery, and so there's just been so many instances when families have either been ashamed or too proud to admit that their involvement in slavery. And I just think it's about time that we're honest with ourselves, and I think that's what we are doing with Heirs of Slavery.
Suzann, sorry, hand back to you. I was taking over a bit there.
No, that's fine, Adrian.
I'm just going to chip in and just say there is a history of people asking this question and coming up with some solutions. You can go back 100 years to Du Bois, W.E.B. Du Bois, the most important African-American intellectual of the 20th century. He has a turn of the century, 1915 essay on the wages of whiteness, where he looks at the psychological and material benefits of white working class workers, from buying into the discourse of whiteness. And that's really the birth of whiteness studies to a degree. You can then go to the 1940s, 1950s and look at Frantz Fanon, the Martinican intellectual psychologist, and his work on looking at the Algerian War and dealing with the psychological problems that arose from the French oppressors. And he catalogues the way in which oppression makes you sick, and that's where, to a degree, the work of, before you get to Kendi Andrews, the work of Paul Gilroy, his book After Empire, and the catchy subtitle, Conviviality and Post-Colonial Melancholia. He uses 19th century psychological theories to explore the knee-jerk, irrational responses to dealing with colonial history. So again, there's people, one could go to Delgado's work and others who deal with, white fragility, which is often linked to racism, which is linked to this past as well. And what Kendi attempts to do is much more popularist, because I know, because I got a free copy. I know quite well, we all we promise, we all hang out, hang out together. We always give each other free things, because everything's free when you get north of Watford, so I got a draft. But his work is much more an attempt to deal with the irrationality and dealing with public figures. Piers Morgan isn't going to give you a lot of sense on this issue. But again, recognizing that there's a psychological damage. Hence, reparations as a restorative program has to be about everybody, has to be about healing on all sides. And that's why I said before, it is a journey, into transformation.
Yes, and it's so unhealthy of us white people to sit and go, we're going to help with reparations in order to help black people. This is for everybody. It's for healing us, because until that happens, until we heal everybody, we won't move forward.
Thank you. There's another question here from Raymond Smith. So this was in response to what can be done. So the question is, what are the channels and how do we accelerate the process? And I believe this is in response to talking about government action and, you know, what can be done.
I think that's a Robert question.
Well,
I'd like to hear what Robert thinks.
Well, look, I think we still. I mean, I'm working with the, you know, as much as I can do with the cross-party group in Parliament. You know, Bel Ribeiro Ade, Diane Abbott, and others, David Lammy, and a couple of Conservatives who were signed up to the well, sponsored the organisation, at least the group forming. I think it's working with them in terms of accelerating it, working with them, hoping that we get a change in government. I think it's also supporting the CARICOM plan in terms of doing as much as possible to ensure that their message and all of its different facets is heard. There's also some independent actors in this field as well. People like the Irish billionaire, not Darian O'Brien, it's Dennis O'Brien. There you go, Dennis O'Brien. There you go. I'm confused him with the rugby player, but you know, and his plan is much more investment based. You know, it's a bit more capitalistic. But I think where necessary supporting, where necessary challenging, but but always being in critical solidarity with those who are trying to do work in this field. That's really, really important. I don't know how much more we can accelerate it because you know, it's a process, it takes time. But what I think we should see more of is more popular programs, newspaper articles, written text, everything exploring dimensions of this and just saying how much of this history is entangled with our present lives. The Cotton Capital series in The Guardian attempts to do that really well. And occasionally you get, you know, there was a radio documentary on Radio 4 looking at reparations a while ago, but there's not enough on colonial history and all of its complexity and its globality. And that's part of the a tragedy of, I think, our educational system, and consequently it leads into a very kind of a myopic understanding of history and a very inward-looking politics, which you know we've seen manifest, you know, recently through things like Brexit as well. So I don't know how much we can put the foot down apart from supporting the real agents of change, like the political groups that are working on this.
Thank you, Robert. And just bringing in a question from Shadona Kettle. So she's a doctoral researcher based at UCL. She says this is a growing movement. So have you considered bringing in other groups, so liaising with other groups in Europe or individuals, you know, just to boost this movement?
Yeah, maybe I could speak to that. We have been approached, you know, through our work by journalists from many countries, Germany. I've got an interview with Sweden, I think it's next week, Swedish TV, Denmark, and France. And interestingly, there is, it's slow, I think, in France, but there is a reparations movement growing in France, and we are going to go and meet them, we hope, in December. And these are two guys that come from Nantes, which is on the west coast. 43% of out during it was the biggest ports link ports such as Bristol and Liverpool, and we are a descendant of families that own ships, and also a descendant from Martinique, as I remember it. Yes, so certainly we are starting to reach out into other countries, and I hope that will grow. I think we should really be, and ideally I would then like to, I think those are the kind of links that we should start to make more of.
Obviously, when John says a reparations movement, he means a heirs acknowledgement movement, not the reparations movement is obviously a separate thing that we try to support. No, it's really, and of course there are groups like Heirs of Slavery in the States already, 2 or 3 and quite active ones, and reparations. is moving ahead in the States on a city-by-city basis in really quite an interesting way. But it's more reparations around the Jim Crow era and damage done on racist grounds to communities of color in the 20th century. But there are models there, and of course the thing that comes up again and again is, and one's told is not discussable, but it's the fact that there was in the 20th century a successful act of apology, contrition, and reparations between the German government and the Jewish people, and so which is worth analogizing with, though one tends to be told not to. But actually, it is an example of how two nations can come through a genocide, a crime against humanity, and end up in some form of peace with each other without in any way denying what happened. I find that really encouraging. Also the other thing I find, and Robert and I've spoken about this before, is that I'm of a generation. I mean, lots of us here today are that were students during the anti-apartheid movement and remember the grassroots support from a hugely diverse range of people in Europe, and particularly in Britain with its colonial history, for the anti-apartheid movement in South Africa that brought about change where many people on the right, the old white right, said it could not happen and would never happen, and we made it happen. And I think another thing as allies, and particularly with our is think how we can support this becoming an issue for our kids, the sort of thing they go to rock festivals and shout about, and because that's how in the end you get governmental change. It's from the grassroots in a diverse way, middle class, working class, and every other diversification.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. So the movement is galvanizing as we speak. So there are links with in France and other movements at the moment. There's a really interesting question here from Davinia Reynolds. So she says, there are many people who have not met individuals from families who have benefited from transatlantic slavery, and the documentary Professor Robert made communicated effectively and galvanized many people across the Caribbean. For these reasons, I'm wondering what needs to take place so public apology or acknowledgement for everyone could take place. Similarly, do you think a documentary showing more beneficiaries addressing what happened could model addressing reparations to other beneficiaries and go towards it becoming less like the unknown and make it seem more doable and more accessible? So it's quite a full question there, two questions in one, I guess. So who wants to take that one, to answer that one?
I mean, Robert's the documentary maker, and you've made that documentary. Is there any taste for any more, do you think?
I hope so. I hope so. I mean, I've pitched a couple of projects, but I'm too old and too ugly for Channel 4, so it may be something that ends up on radio, to be quite honest. But I think Davina's completely right. I think we need to really keep winning the cultural battle, so to speak, in terms of making sure that people are aware of the history, the issues. I think the second part of the question, yes, there was the Trevelyan film that BBC made, but I think more films like that, especially dealing with the practicalities, would be good. There's also the Harewood, a film where David Harewood goes to Harewood House as part of one of his film projects. But I think the more of this that we can have, the more it becomes normal and less marginal, but becomes part of our public discourse. In the same way that it's not completely comparable, but the way in which the statue debate in the southern states in America was once very, very marginal, but has now become much more central, more normative, and people understand the history and can understand why these statues were put up as acts of psychological terror rather than being acts of historical a recognition. And therefore we're able to make in many of the southern states make that move to have the statues removed. So it is still about conscientizing, making people aware. So yes, I would like to see much more of it.
Mm-hmm. And then also, John, you talked about standing in Jamaica and having that public apology. I think you're still there, and how powerful the apology was to the recipients. Are you still there, John? I think we've lost John, yeah. But it's a very powerful point about, you know, having this discourse and just making it become, you know, more I guess normalized to people, so that, you know, we have this interaction. Yeah. I'm just scrolling through questions.
Just 3 more minutes, Suzann.
Yeah. I know Juanette made a comment earlier, so she talked about, was it chocolate? So the idea of milk chocolate started in Jamaica. I'm not sure if you're there, but Juanette.
I am, Suzann.
Yeah.
Basically, I was saying that I'd booked a tour of
Yeah.
the Chelsea Physics Gardens, and the tour guide brought that bit. Get your chocolate bar on the shelf now, on the shop shelf. The actual idea started. I was quite chuffed about that, coming from Jamaica.
There's a comment here from Raymond. So I know, Robert, you talked about reparations. So the 5 levers that you use, you talked about the spirituality, so how important that is, the Rastafarian movement. So Raymond comments, you know, apart from any moral imperative, he's glad you brought up the God factor. So God requires and blesses us to do justice for wrongs. So do you have any comments around Raymond's comments at all?
Yeah, look, I don't think religion and even Christian theology is outside of this debate, partly because of our country's history and entanglement with Christianity, the legal structure, the understanding of restoration, the way in which that impacts even the criminal justice system, you know, the reformatory tradition. It's very much integral with how we think about the nation, how we think about justice, how we think, therefore, about the pathway towards reconciling this particular history. I think what I would add is this, in terms of the spirituality of it, is that I don't think we can do it without the support of religious groups, you know, because there are similar traditions within Islam, the similar traditions in Hinduism, you know, so it is very much something that we can pull other religious groups into. And also we shouldn't, you know, deny the fact that it's religious groups who are driving it. The Church of England here in the UK, in North America, it was the Jesuits, one of the first major institutions to come out and offer a form of reparation, compensation for its role in using slave labor as part of its mission in the Americas. So yeah, so that's what I would say. You know, I think it's we can't leave religion out of it, and we also need to pull religious traditions into this debate and into this discussion. But it's also, you know, to do a Barack Obama, it's about people of faith and people of no faith as well.
Could I say briefly that I've been, as Robert knows, and maybe all of you know, the Church of England is currently designing its perpetual fund for enslavement repair fund, and having great debates about what shape that should take and how it should deliver its money. But they have just started a survey of really everyone who's interested, from whatever angle in the area of colonialism and its legacies, on how that fund should work and what issues need to be addressed. And I might paste that into the meeting group chat, because we've been asked to distribute it around people. So and that, you know, we could come back to the role of religion in the enslavement period and in addressing the legacies and healing, and the Church of England initiative, which is hugely controversial because there are a lot of very right-wing people within that church who don't like this idea, but is also a really interesting idea for something that many other churches could emulate and follow and acknowledge, and other institutions, in terms of making a real difference in the reparations field.
Right.
Yeah. And Alex, you alluded just then to healing. So I just wanted to read out a comment from Susan. So she says, "Thank you so much for this. My family is from Grenada. It's good to hear about this happening. also knowing that there are those who want to be actively anti-racist is very encouraging and healing. So I just wanted to read that out before we close.
Thank you, Suzanne. That's really helpful. I just need to do a few things to round off the evening officially. I see you got your hand up, Sean. There will be a chance to continue the conversation beyond the 9:30 time if you can stick around. I just need to give a few things just to finish off officially before we officially close out at 9:30. So back to this, Suzanne, I forgot to mention your book, actually. I'm sorry about that. There is your book, Dear Piers Morgan. You are yourself a published author. And so that is also a very interesting read from a psychodynamic perspective. So big up to you, Suzanne, on your book as well. Just to make you aware, there is a UK Reparations Conference coming up the 21st to 22nd of October at the Friends House in London, if you're anywhere near London. But also, I believe you can, at least this notice suggests you can also join online as well. So if you want to continue this conversation and continue your own education on these issues, a number of our panel are going to be there as well to join that conversation. But just to also big up Cowrie Scholarship Foundation. We didn't charge, our panel members haven't charged for their appearance tonight, but we would like to be able to just very practically support a cause which I believe is very much aligned to what we've been talking about. And Cowrie Scholarship Foundation, the heirs of slavery, are supporting them as a foundation. And we just invite you to make a contribution to them because you haven't had to pay a ticket fee for this evening. See if you can add your support to them. They do some really important work. And if you could just mention that you came to them through White Allies Network, just to help us to have a sense of the impact that we might be having in terms of encouraging people's donations, that'd be great. Just a few other things next time beyond. Our next meeting is 31st of November. This is a network review meeting. So this is to network members only. If you want to become a network member, please do sign up if you're not already. But this is a chance for us to look back at the last 18 months, review where we've got to so far, and also to start deciding on the future focus. So that's open to all members, whether you're on a aspiring White Ally member or a co-mentor member. Please do join us on the 31st of November. That won't be generally available on Eventbrite because it's just for membership only, but we'd like to have that review meeting before we go any further. We also will be booking up that session that we missed with the Black curriculum to see how we can work with them and potentially partner with them as well in their work. We also want to look at the issue of decolonization. And it might be we tackle that first because Black curriculum can build on that conversation. What does it mean to decolonize curriculum and other aspects of our lives and our histories? What is it and what does it mean in practice? All those meetings will be on Zoom at 8 to 9:30. I also want to mention again our resource hub. There's so many resources here. If you want to continue to educate yourself on these issues, and we are just so aware as a network just how much there is to learn. There are so many resources, over 200 resources there, including links to panel members' work and documentaries that you can tap into there to be able to continue to educate yourselves and other people on these issues that we've been talking about today. So that's about it. 31st of November. Do sign up if you're not a member yet. We would love to have you as part of this network, and so that we can together become true allies against racism.